The macabre history of the Miltons. All 10 kids were hidden from the system since birth. In the autumn of 2022, real estate attorney Karen Mitchell received what should have been a routine call. The estate of Eleanor Milton, a reclusive widow, who had died at age 84, needed to be processed for probate. Eleanor had lived alone on a sprawling 15-acre property in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, and according to county records, she had no living relatives or heirs. What Karen discovered when she first set foot on the Milton estate would challenge everything she thought. She knew about family secrets and the dark corners where people can disappear from society entirely. The Milton mansion sat at the end of a winding dirt road, hidden behind towering pine trees that seemed to swallow sunlight before it could reach the ground. Built in 1923 by Eleanor's grandfather, industrialist Theodore Milton. The Gothic Revival structure loomed like something from a Victorian nightmare, all dark stone, pointed arches, and windows that stared down like hollow eyes. Eleanor Milton had lived there for 63 years, ever since inheriting the property in 1959 after her parents' deaths in a car accident. County records showed she had rarely left the estate, receiving deliveries through a local service and conducting what little business she had through mail and, in later years, telephone calls. Neighbors, scattered few and far between in the remote mountain location, described her as a ghost-like figure occasionally glimpsed walking the property at dusk. But Eleanor Milton had harbored a secret that went far deeper than simple reclusiveness. As Karen began her initial walkthrough of the mansion, she noticed peculiarities that didn't align with the home of an elderly woman living alone. The kitchen was far too large for one person, with industrial-sized appliances and evidence of cooking for many people. Bedrooms on the second and third floors showed signs of recent habitation, personal belongings, clothing in various sizes, and most puzzling of all, children's items scattered throughout multiple rooms. The discovery that would unravel the Milton family mystery came when Karen noticed a discrepancy in the house's floor plan. According to the original blueprints filed with the county in 1923, the mansion should have had a basement level accessible through a door off the main kitchen. But when Karen searched for this entrance, she found only a wall covered by an antique china cabinet that appeared to have been permanently fixed in place. Working with a state maintenance crew, Karen had the cabinet moved, revealing a heavy wooden door secured with multiple locks that appeared to be recently installed. Beyond that door lay a staircase descending into what the original plans had designated as a basement storage area. What Karen found in the basement of the Milton mansion defied explanation and would haunt her for the rest of her life. The basement had been converted into a complex of living spaces, 10 small rooms, each barely large enough for a single bed, a small dresser, and a wooden chair. The rooms had no windows, no individual lighting beyond a single bare bulb, and no privacy. Each door had been removed and replaced with heavy curtains. At the center of this underground complex was a larger common area containing long wooden tables, benches, and shelves lined with textbooks dating from the 1960s through the 1990s. But most disturbing of all were the personal belongings Karen found throughout the basement rooms: clothing in children's and adult sizes, handmade toys carved from wood, journals filled with careful handwriting, and dozens of photographs showing children of various ages in what appeared to be family groupings, children who bore striking resemblances to each other and to Eleanor Milton herself. The photographs told a story that official records had never documented. They showed Eleanor Milton not as a reclusive widow, but as the mother of what appeared to be 10 children, 5 boys and 5 girls, photographed at various stages of childhood and adolescence over what seemed to span several decades. The children in the earliest photographs appeared to be from the 1960s, while the most recent seemed to date from the late 1990s. Karen immediately contacted local authorities, triggering an investigation that would uncover one of the most complex cases of family concealment in American history. Detective Ray Sullivan, a veteran investigator with the New York State Police, had seen unusual family situations before, but nothing had prepared him for what he would discover about the Milton estate. The investigation began with a basic question: who were the children in the photographs, and where were they now? Eleanor Milton's death certificate listed her as unmarried, with no surviving children. But the evidence in the basement suggested she had raised a large family in complete secrecy for decades. The first breakthrough came when investigators expanded their search of the mansion and discovered Eleanor's private study, a room that had been locked and was not included in the original estate inventory. Inside, they found meticulous records spanning 60 years' birth logs, growth charts, educational progress reports, and detailed journals documenting the daily lives of 10 children who, according to official records, had never existed. Journals revealed a woman whose relationship with reality had become increasingly tenuous over the decades. The earliest entries, dating from 1962, described her joy at the birth of her first child, son she named Theodore after her grandfather, but these entries contained no mention of a father, no reference to pregnancy, and no explanation for how she had acquired the infant. As investigators read deeper into Eleanor's journals, a chilling pattern emerged. The children were not born. To Eleanor Milton, they had been acquired through what appeared to be a decades-long pattern of abduction and concealment. Eleanor's entries described rescuing children from what she perceived as unsuitable families, bringing them to the estate where she could raise them according to her own twisted vision of proper child-rearing. The journals revealed Eleanor's belief that she was saving these children from the corruption of modern society. She wrote extensively about protecting them from television, popular music, modern education, and what she saw as the moral decay of contemporary American culture. In her mind, the basement complex was not a prison, but a sanctuary where children could grow up pure and untainted by outside influences. The educational materials found in the basement supported this delusion. Eleanor had created a comprehensive curriculum based on textbooks from the 1940s and 1950s, emphasizing classical literature, traditional mathematics, and a worldview that had been outdated even when the books were new. The children's journals and schoolwork, preserved in careful files, showed years of education conducted entirely within the basement complex. But, as investigators examined the children's writings more closely, they discovered evidence of psychological trauma that journals never acknowledged. The children's essays and diary entries, written in careful handwriting that suggested years of practice, contained subtle but disturbing references to punishment, isolation, and a pervasive fear of the outside world that went far beyond normal childhood anxiety. The most haunting discovery came when investigators found Eleanor's family photographs, hundreds of pictures documenting birthday parties, holiday celebrations, and everyday life in the basement complex. The photographs showed children who appeared healthy and well cared for, but whose eyes held a quality that experienced investigators recognized as the thousand-yard stare of trauma victims. The children in the photographs seemed to age normally through childhood and adolescence, but then they simply disappeared from the visual record. The most recent photographs were dated 1998, showing what appeared to be the youngest children in their late teens. After that date, Eleanor's documentation became sparse and increasingly incoherent, filled with references to departures and transitions that she never fully explained. As the investigation expanded, authorities began cross-referencing Eleanor's records with missing children reports dating back to the 1960s. The process was complicated by the decades-old nature of many cases and Eleanor's habit of changing the children's names shortly after bringing them to the estate. But slowly, investigators began identifying matches between children who had disappeared from communities across the Northeast and the faces in Eleanor's photographs. The revelation that Eleanor Milton had been abducting and concealing children for over 30 years sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across multiple states. But the investigation raised more questions than it answered. What had happened to the 10 children who had spent their formative years in the basement of the Milton mansion? Where were they now? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how many other children might Eleanor have taken who were never documented in her meticulous records? The search for answers would lead investigators into a labyrinth of false identities, buried records, and family secrets that stretched across decades. But as they dug deeper into the Milton family history, they would discover that Eleanor's crimes were not the isolated actions of a disturbed individual, but part of a multi-generational pattern of control and concealment that had its roots in the very foundation of the Milton family legacy. The basement of the Milton mansion had given up its immediate secrets, but the true scope of the family's dark history was only beginning to emerge. The investigation into Eleanor Milton's basement complex had uncovered evidence of child abduction spanning 3 decades. But as detectives delved deeper into the family's history, they discovered that Eleanor's crimes were not an aberration, culmination of a generational pattern of control and concealment that stretched back to the mansion's very foundations. Detective Ray Sullivan's breakthrough came when he began investigating the Milton family's financial records. Eleanor had lived comfortably for decades without any visible source of income, yet she had maintained the large estate, purchased supplies for multiple children, and somehow funded her elaborate concealment operation. The answer lay in a trust fund established by her grandfather, Theodore Milton. In 1924, trust with conditions so specific and unusual that they suggested Theodore had anticipated the family's future need for secrecy. The trust was structured to provide Eleanor with substantial monthly payments on the condition that she never marry, never have officially documented children, and never allow outsiders to visit the family estate for extended periods. Most chillingly, the trust included provisions for educational expenses for undocumented household members and security measures to protect family privacy. Language that seemed to anticipate exactly the situation investigators had discovered. As investigators examined Theodore Milton's personal papers, housed in a climate-controlled vault beneath the mansion's library, they uncovered evidence that Eleanor's grandfather had established the estate as a place where the family could pursue practices that would not be tolerated in mainstream society. Theodore's journals, written in the careful handwriting of a man accustomed to documenting his actions, revealed a disturbing philosophy about child rearing and social control that would echo through 3 generations of Miltons. Theodore Milton believed that modern society was fundamentally flawed in its approach to raising children. He wrote extensively about his conviction that children should be removed from the corrupting influence of their biological families and raised in controlled environments by individuals better equipped to shape their moral and intellectual development. In his view, the legal and social systems that protected parental rights were obstacles to creating a more perfect generation of human beings. The vault contained evidence that Theodore had put his theories into practice during the 1920s and 1930s, taking in children from families he deemed unfit and raising them in isolation on the estate. Unlike Eleanor's later abductions, Theodore's activities appeared to have been conducted with some level of legal cover. He had served as an informal foster parent for local authorities, taking in children whose families had been destroyed by economic hardship or social problems. But Theodore's foster care was actually a sophisticated form of psychological experimentation. The children in his care were subjected to educational programs designed to strip away their previous identities and replace them with personalities crafted according to Theodore's specifications. Those who adapted successfully were allowed to remain on the estate as servants and companions. Those who resisted were, according to Theodore's carefully coded journal entries, relocated to more suitable environments, a euphemism that investigators would never fully decipher. The pattern continued with Eleanor's father, William Milton, who inherited the estate and the family's twisted traditions in 1943. William's approach was more sophisticated than his father's, involving what appeared to be early experiments in psychological conditioning and behavior modification. The basement complex that Eleanor would later use for her own children had originally been constructed by William as a development facility where children could be isolated and subjected to intensive psychological reshaping. William's records, found in a hidden compartment within Theodore's vault, documented his belief that children's personalities were entirely malleable. If the right techniques were applied during critical developmental periods, he had studied early psychology texts and correspondence with researchers who would later be associated with government mind control experiments, adapting their techniques for his own use in the Milton estate's basement. The children under William's control were subjected to sensory deprivation, sleep manipulation, and systematic breaking down of their sense of individual identity. William believed he was creating more perfect human beings, free from the psychological damage he attributed to normal family structures and social influences. His journals described the children as subjects rather than individuals, documenting their responses to various forms of psychological manipulation with the detached tone of a scientist recording laboratory results. When Eleanor inherited the estate in 1959, she was already deeply conditioned by a lifetime of exposure to her family's twisted philosophies, but her approach differed significantly from her father's and grandfather's methods, where they had focused on psychological experimentation and control. Eleanor's motivation seemed rooted in a desperate desire for family connection that had been warped by decades of isolation and indoctrination. Eleanor's early journal entries revealed a woman who understood that her family's practices were wrong, but who felt powerless to break free from the patterns that had defined 3 generations of Milton. Her first abduction, in 1962, was described in her journal as an impulsive act driven by overwhelming loneliness rather than the calculated experimentation her predecessors had practiced. But once Eleanor had crossed that line, the family's generational patterns reasserted themselves. Each subsequent abduction became easier to justify, each child's integration into the basement complex more systematic. Eleanor had inherited not just the estate and the trust fund, but the psychological framework that made her family's crimes seem not only acceptable, but necessary. The investigation into the Milton family's victims proved far more complex than authorities had initially anticipated. Many of the children who had disappeared into the estate over the decades had been from marginalized families, runaways, children from broken homes, kids whose disappearances hadn't triggered extensive searches. The Milton family had been skilled at identifying children whose absence would be noticed least by society. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators realized that some of the children who had been raised in the Milton basement complex had never left the estate at all. Ground-penetrating radar revealed multiple burial sites scattered throughout the property, containing remains that appeared to date from different periods spanning the estate's dark history. Forensic examination of these remains suggested that children who had died while in the Milton family's custody, whether from natural causes, accidents, or other circumstances, had been quietly buried on the property rather than reported to authorities. The exact number of children who had died at the estate would never be fully determined, as records were incomplete and some burial sites appeared to have been disturbed over the years. The search for the children who had survived their time in the basement complex led investigators across the country. Some had been released or had escaped as young adults, disappearing into society with false identities Eleanor had created for them. Others had been transferred to what Eleanor's journals referred to as affiliated facilities, suggesting that the Milton estate was part of a larger network of individuals engaged in similar activities. The few survivors investigators were able to locate painted a picture of profound psychological trauma that had shaped their entire adult lives. Most had struggled with basic social interactions, trusting relationships, and maintaining stable employment. Several had spent time in mental health facilities, with their childhood experiences at the Milton estate dismissed by therapists as elaborate delusions rather than recovered memories of actual events. James Patterson, who investigators determined had spent 12 years in the Milton basement complex between 1975 and 1987, was one of the few survivors willing to speak publicly about his experiences. Now in his 50s and living under an assumed name in California, James described the estate as existing in a bubble completely separate from the outside world. According to James, the children in the basement complex had been taught that the outside world had been destroyed by nuclear war, and that they were among the few survivors living in underground shelters. Eleanor had shown them carefully selected news footage and photographs to support this narrative, creating a mythology that made escape seem impossible and pointless. The children's education had focused heavily on practical skills: cooking, cleaning, basic mechanics, and agriculture, as if they were being prepared to rebuild civilization rather than integrate into existing society. But perhaps most damaging was the systematic destruction of their sense of individual identity. Children were discouraged from forming close relationships with siblings, encouraged to report on each other's behavior, and punished for any expression of independence or curiosity about their past lives. Eleanor Milton died alone in 2022, taking with her the full scope of her family's crimes and the location of children who might still be missing. Her death marked the end of 3 generations of systematic child abduction and psychological abuse that had operated in plain sight for nearly a century. The Milton estate was eventually demolished, but not before investigators had thoroughly documented every room, every hidden compartment, and every burial site. The property remains empty today, marked only by a small plaque acknowledging the children who suffered and died there. The case led to significant changes in how authorities investigate isolated properties and track missing children across decades. But perhaps more importantly, it served as a reminder that evil often hides behind facades of respectability and tradition, and that some family secrets are too dark to remain buried forever. The 10 children whose photographs were found in Eleanor Milton's basement complex represented only the most recent victims of a generational curse that consumed the Milton family for nearly a century. Their faces, staring out from those carefully preserved photographs, serve as a reminder of the price paid when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members from those who would exploit their innocence for twisted purposes. In the end, the macabre history of the Miltons reveals a truth too disturbing for easy comprehension: that monsters are not always strangers lurking in shadows, but sometimes they are pillars of the community, inheritors of respected names, and guardians of family traditions too terrible to acknowledge. The Milton estate may be gone, but the questions it raised about family secrets, institutional failure, and the capacity for human evil will linger far longer than the ruins of its foundation.
Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,